There's research out there that shows that people who feel emotionally connected to their partners report 40% higher sexual satisfaction than people who don't feel connected to their partners. 40%. I mean, that's not a small amount. We're talking about the difference between sex that feels pleasurable and sex that feels tolerable. Which begs the question, how often is sexual frustration really just emotional neglect?
Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera.
I've been thinking about this. I mean, obviously, I've been thinking about this. And what strikes me is how rarely people make the connection between sexual frustration and emotional neglect on their own. I mean, it's not because people aren't paying attention. I mean, maybe sometimes people aren't paying attention, but mostly it's just because when you're in it, like you can't really see the forest for the trees. So when you are living with sexual frustration, all you can see is the frustration, right? Because that's what you feel. That's what the arguments are about. That's what you might be avoiding arguing about or lying awake thinking about. Just the sex, the frequency, the distance, or the rejection. So it makes total sense that your focus would be there because that's where it seems like the problem lives. But I'm not so sure that that's where it starts. I have been in relationships where the emotional conditions were good and relationships where it wasn't. And what I noticed, and not right away, I mean, it took me a while to see this clearly for myself, but what I noticed was that my experience of sex was completely different depending on what kind of relationship I was in. Not just the quality of the sex itself, you know? My relationship with my own desire and whether I wanted it, whether I could be present, whether there was something that I was trying to manage, like all of those things change based on the relationship container. And for a long time, I really did not connect that. I thought I was just experiencing, whatever it was, that some relationships have better sex than others, or I don't know, maybe it's just the luck of the draw, chemistry, compatibility, whatever. But it didn't occur to me that the emotional conditions were the variable. I mean, because that's like the soil, right? And the quality of the soil determines what grows. Duh. Like, didn't occur to me. But that's what got me thinking about like this emotional satisfaction and sexual frustration piece is because emotional satisfaction creates the conditions for sexual satisfaction, and emotional neglect, well, it sets you up for sexual frustration. And the research backs this up. So, I mean, these are my thoughts, but there is research that backs it up because it's not just the 40% gap in sexual satisfaction, but that runs in both directions. So sexual satisfaction feeds emotional intimacy, and emotional intimacy feeds sexual satisfaction, so it's not just a correlation, it's generative. It's generative, which means that if one starts to erode, it takes the other with it. And by the time most people realize that something is amiss, you know, the emotional satisfaction and the sexual satisfaction has been compromised, and now they can't tell which one started first, chicken or the egg kind of situation. I think that gets missed in conversations. We miss the role of awareness or the lack thereof. And so many people are living with emotional neglect in relationships, but they just don't really know what it is. This is not denial. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. They just don't have a reference point. So, if the relationship that you're in is mostly emotionally available, and you still feel unmet, you might genuinely believe that what you are experiencing is just normal. That's just how relationships are, because that's what we start saying. Like, but that frustration that you're carrying, sexually and otherwise, you might just think that that's the texture of being in a relationship for quite some time. And so you adapt. And notice I said that if it's there's emotionally availability. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're being, froze out. Anyway, you start to adapt. And, the thing about adapting is you stop longing for something more, you stop reaching for something else. Maybe you stop expecting to feel connected in a way that feeds you, because maybe you stop even thinking that that is a real thing. Right? You don't think that that kind of connection is a real thing, or maybe it's just not available. At least that's what you tell yourself. And so you think like, oh well, this isn't terrible, so it's fine. And sexual frustration just becomes, part of your life. It's the landscape. It's just something that you live with. But that's the insidious part too, is not just that emotional neglect creates sexual frustration. And I just want to say again that emotional neglect does not necessarily mean completely emotionally unavailable. It doesn't mean without emotion. But when you don't feel emotionally connected, it creates sexual frustration. But it can be really quiet, because over a long period of time, when something is just the same for a long time, it's hard to identify what's missing. You know something is off. You know that maybe the sex feels like a chore or an obligation or whatever, but you can't really explain why, because it's just not obvious. I know someone who was in a long-term relationship. I mean, and they were together for a while, so it looked like they were going the distance. And one of them suffered a significant loss, and, so there was like all this grief and all the weight that comes with that. And the other person was there supporting them. They understood, it's losing someone close to you is hard, but they still were feeling disconnected. And that went on for a couple of years. And they were patient because, grief and the recovery from grief can last indefinitely. But just because they understood doesn't mean that they were feeling emotionally fulfilled. And so, that went on for so long that desire started to wane. I mean, the person who was being patient stopped feeling like they wanted to be sexual with their partner. And, so time passed, and even when the grief started to shift into a steady thing, because grief is one of those things that it doesn't really go away. The volume just gets turned down. So even when the grief was low enough that the relationship could function in a way that was about the relationship again, the other person wasn't feeling it because it had gone on for so long. And, in this kind of thing, nobody's the villain in this story. One person was in grief and the other person just ran out of road. And somewhere in between all of that, there was a lack of fulfillment, because there was an emotional neglect, and by design, grief takes up a lot of space, so there's not always room. So it just created the condition where things just stopped working in the relationship, and the connection just got wonky. I want to be careful with the word neglect here, though, because I don't think it always means what we think it means. Neglect can be intentional. Someone can check out, they can withhold, or decide on some level that the relationship just doesn't require their full presence, right? But then there's also the kind of neglect that I was just talking about, where someone doesn't have the capacity, or maybe they don't have the tools. They could just be depleted. When you're in grief or overwhelm, you know, that's a lot. But the impact is the same either way. You're still not getting what you need. And the reason behind it doesn't change what it feels like for you. It doesn't change, what it does to desire. But that distinction is really important, like the distinction between intentional neglect and incapacity. I mean, that matters because, that changes how you look at the person you're with. If someone is withholding on purpose, that's one conversation. But if they just don't have the tools or the capacity right now, that's a different conversation. But, if they don't even know they're doing it, if they've never had a relationship where emotional attentiveness was the norm, so they don't even know what they're not giving, that is also something else entirely. Either way, if you are the one feeling the disconnect, there's probably a conversation that needs to happen, because, understanding why someone can't give you what you need doesn't make the feeling change, but it does give you a different lens to look through, but it could still result in feeling sexually frustrated. I mean, I don't know, might feel like I'm babbling there, but just wanted to make that clear. But look, getting back on track, what I keep coming back to is this, and I think this is the thing here, is that when the person who could relieve frustration, sexual frustration for you, is the same person creating the conditions for it, when it's the same person, right? Which means you can't like reach toward what you want without also acknowledging what isn't working, right? So every time you initiate, you feel the distance, or every time you have sex, maybe you feel a little bit further away afterward than you did before. That's, you know, not just frustrating, it's disorienting, because the solution and the problem, I don't know if it, I'm using air quotes here for problem, but the solution and the problem have the same face. And so, sometimes you just stop reaching altogether because you just don't want to, because wanting something and not getting nourished by it sometimes feels worse than not having it at all. And sometimes when you get to that place, it's hard to find your way forward, which again is its own conversation. But that makes me think about what people are doing sometimes when they go outside of the relationship, is they're trying to get needs met. And that's really what I've been trying to get to, is that, and I'm not advocating at all for infidelity, but sometimes it isn't about lust. Sometimes it's not about sex. Sometimes it's really just a terrible attempt at getting needs met. I mean, it's essentially non-monogamy. It's just unethical, because there's no agreement. And I think sometimes that happens because, not because someone is selfish or dishonest at their core, but because they don't know how to use their words, or they think that, it's about the sex. But when I think about like how things might look different, not necessarily fixed, but how different it would look if you could just see it, to like look at sexual frustration and ask honestly, and now I'm talking about people who are cheating or considering cheating. But if you can look at your sexual frustration and get curious and ask yourself, like, is this about sex? Like, or is it about something that's missing emotionally? Something that maybe I feel too vulnerable to admit. Because most of the time people don't think about it that much. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but a lot of the time people just go out and do things and deal with the consequences later, which, is a recipe for emotional disaster. Sometimes that blows up your whole life. But, if you stay focused just on the sex, if you're just talking about like frequency and rejection or whatever, then you're trying to solve for the sexual problem, right? You're thinking about initiation and timing and what you want in bed versus what the other person wants in bed. But nothing changes if you're only trying to solve for the sex, if the sex isn't the problem in the first place, right? And then of course there's the other person, the one who may not even know what they're not giving. Maybe they love their partner and they think things are fine. And they would be genuinely surprised to hear that the other person is not satisfied, right? And, I said all that to say because emotional neglect doesn't require intent. It just requires a gap between what someone needs and what they're getting. And that gap can exist in relationships that are full of love and good intentions with, people who would both say that they're happy, but not happy enough. So we got to get back to the question, like, how often is sexual frustration really just emotional neglect? And I know I didn't answer this. I didn't answer this, because there's no universal answer. But I do think that it is something that people are up against more often than they realize. And, I think that's also the reason that it might go unrecognized for so long, because we're taught to treat sex and emotion as two separate things. But your emotional life, the emotional life of a relationship, isn't over there and your sex life is over here, because they are, two sides of the same coin. The emotional conditions are the soil, and the sexual experiences are what grow from that. And I might be oversimplifying here, but that's just the best metaphor I could come up with. So, you know, if you are feeling sexually frustrated, then maybe it's time to explore the question. Are you sexually frustrated, or are you just feeling emotionally neglected? Because sometimes the most useful thing that you can do is to call something by the right name. If any of this landed, if it made you stop for a second and pause and think, share this episode with someone else who might need to hear it too. You can post it or text it, or, just pass it along. Follow the show so that new episodes show up in your feed. And, 5-star rating, if it's warranted, and a short review genuinely helps more people find the show. So if you feel inclined, do that too. And next week, we are going to explore something else that I'm not sure about yet, but it's gonna be good. So I'll see you back here, same channel, same time. Ciao.